Module 5, the Balancing Act. What can I do as a copyright user in education? This video simplifies a very complex subject. This video is not a substitute for legal advice, which should be sought in cases where the application of general principles is unclear. The Copyright Act encourages copyright holders to create new works and ensures that they are fairly compensated. But it also balances the right of copyright holders with the needs of copyright users by creating some exceptions to those rights. Let's examine the exceptions that are relevant to you as a copyright user in an educational institution. The Copyright Act gives general exceptions for all Canadians, and it gives specific exceptions for particular groups, such as educational institutions, libraries, and people with perceptual disabilities, among others. A general exception you may have heard a lot about lately is fair dealing. You're most likely to encounter the fair dealing exception by ways of your college's fair dealing policy guidelines. This policy is based on legal advice that interprets the fair dealing exception in the Copyright Act, and two landmark Supreme Court cases, one in 2004 and a more recent one in July 2012, involving the educational use of short excerpts. If your college has a fair dealing policy, following its guidelines is the best way to ensure your use of a protected work is fair to the copyright holder. If you find you need to exceed the guidelines or need assistance understanding them, or even if you want to know whether your college has a fair dealing policy, always refer to the person designated by your college to answer copyright questions. Let's look a little closer at the fair dealing exception itself. The fair dealing exception allows all Canadians to use protected works without permission from the copyright holder and without payment, but only if the dealing is fair. But what's fair? In a landmark case in 2004, the Supreme Court of Canada provided Canadians guidance on assessing whether their use of protected works is fair. First, we have to ask, is the copying or use for an allowable purpose? How do we tell? The fair dealing exception in Section 29 of the Copyright Act tells us that allowable purposes are research, private study, education, parody, satire, criticism, review, or newspaper reporting. If we're using a protected work for an allowable purpose, then the Supreme Court asks us to evaluate our use against 5 further factors. We don't have to have a checkmark for all these, but on balance, there should be more checkmarks than X's. 1. The amount of the dealing must be fair. 2. The character of the dealing must be fair. 3. There should be no reasonable alternative to the dealing. 4. The nature of the material must be considered in assessing fairness. 5. The effect of the dealing on the original material must be taken in account. All uses of protected works can be assessed under the general fair dealing exception. In a college educational situation, follow the fair dealing policy guidelines, if your college has adopted them. However, the Copyright Act also contains specific exceptions for educational institutions. These exceptions are available to you as educators under the authority of your institution. They are useful because they sometimes offer us more clarity and certainty than the general fair dealing exception. Generally, the exceptions cover copying works for tests and exams, performing protected works in the classroom, conditions for recording TV and broadcasts, use of protected works in online education, educational use of publicly available material on the Internet. You'll find these exceptions, as well as the terms and conditions for their use, incorporated into your college's copyright practices or guidelines, and we've incorporated them into the practical modules so you know how to use them in your everyday use of protected works. As always, refer to your college's copyright practices and guidelines. If you're not sure how to apply the fair dealing policy guidelines, or have questions about the educational exceptions, ask the person designated by your college to answer copyright questions. Your college library is a good place to start.